later. Washington Journal continues.
We're back with Cliff Young of Ipsos Polling. He's going to tell us a little bit about what they saw coming and what actually happened. Cliff, what drove people to the polls to go vote this year?
Well, on the day of, we interviewed 39,000 voters with our partner Thomson Reuters. We asked about 20 questions to get an idea about why they went out there, what their calculus was. What did we find? Well, in general, as we know with midterms, it's typically a referendum on the president. In this case, it was Trump. That really drove Democrats to the polls. But more specifically, for Democrats, it was about health care. For Republicans, it was about immigration. And independents were a mixed bag. It was about economy and jobs on the one hand and health care on the other.
So what was the breakdown as far as gender with the polls this time?
Well, obviously, women skewed Democrat versus Republican very strongly. We were seeing that in the pre-election polls, and it was definitely the case on Election Day.
And was there a big difference between the last midterm election and now, or were the same issues coming up?
No, the issue set has changed. Indeed, specifically it was about health care and immigration. In 2014, it was about jobs and the economy. So the issue set has really changed over the last few years. From 2016 on, we saw the same issue sets driving people to the polls. Like I was saying before, it was differentially from a partisan perspective. Republicans went to the polls because of immigration primarily. Democrats went to the polls because of health care. And once again, independents, it was sort of a mixed bag, a mix of different issues.
And we spent the last hour talking about the urban, rural, suburban divide. Did that show up in your polls anywhere?
Yeah, we really, really see that. Indeed, what I would say is two sort of big takeaways from this electoral cycle, this midterm electoral cycle. On the one hand, huge high turnout, right? Historic turnout, 49%. That's the highest since the 1960s. 113 million, more or less, people showed up at the polls. Very, very energized. But the second point is, it's really a tale of two Americas. Very, very polarized along ideological issues, but also geographic issues. And your guest hour, or your last hour talking about urban, suburban, rural divide really came out in the polling and in the results themselves.
Now, we had a lot of talk during the last presidential election about how accurate polling is. How accurate were your polls, and did we do better in polling this time than we did in the last presidential election?
I would say the following. Polling gets a passing grade, but barely passing, and I'm a pollster, right? So I'll give myself a grade. Hopefully I'm not inflating it too much. I think we did a great job in general. We knew that the House was probably going to go Democrat. We knew that the Senate was going to stay Republican. Probably they expand their lead. It looks like they will. We knew that the Democrats were going to pick up governorships. That was great. I think overall, good job. But specifically in states, we had some problems as an industry. You take, for instance, Indiana. We underestimated the number of Republicans that were going to come out. In Nevada, we underestimated the number of Democrats. So we still have work, especially in the states. And as we know, general elections in the United States are not about the popular vote. They're about the Electoral College, those 6 or 7 swing states. You got to give them right. And that was our problem as an industry in 2016.
We want you to join this conversation. If you have any questions about what we're talking about with the Ipsos poll, please join us in by calling in. Democrats, you can call in at 202-748-8000. Republicans, call in at 202-748-8001. Independents, you can call at 202-748-8002. And you can always reach us on social media at C-SPAN, at C-SPAN WJ on Twitter, and on Facebook at facebook.com/cspan. One of the things that we heard a lot of talk about earlier coming into this election were about women voters. How did they turn out in this midterm election? Did women voters go one way or the other, or was it split among those regional lines again?
Yeah, once again, there obviously variability across regions, more rural, less metro regions. Women tended to vote Republican, and more urban, in larger states, they tended to vote Democrat. But overall, what we saw was, with this huge expansion of the electorate, this historic sort of turnout at 49%, we saw a lot more women showing up at the polls, a lot more young people and minorities, Hispanics and African Americans. That's what tilted it for Democrats on the House side. And so definitely greater turnout and even differential turnout in certain places.
And you just brought up my next point. I was going to ask about the age of voters. Do we see a increase in younger voters? Did we see an increase in older voters? Was there any age issue in the voters who showed up this time?
Yeah, on average, midterms are elections where typically older, more affluent voters show up at the polls, more affluent white voters show up at the polls. This midterm election was slightly different. The profile of the electorate was much more Democratic leaning, much younger on average, much more female, and much more urban than in past years.
And real quickly, you said earlier that you had historic turnout for this midterm election. Did we see as many people who would that turned out for a presidential election, or historic for midterms?
No, just historic for midterms. At 49%, the average is about 40%. In 2014, it was actually only 36%. It was the lowest one in modern history. And when it comes to presidential elections, we're talking about the 60% range. 60 to 65, that's a typical presidential election. So no, it's still lower. It's not as important in many people's minds. It doesn't energize the bases as much as a general election or presidential election. But for midterms, it was historic.
Let's let Dwayne, who's calling from Gautier, Mississippi, join in. Dwayne's calling on the Republican line. Dwayne, good morning.
How you doing? I'm glad you let me call in today. What I wanted to talk about is the polling, the election, and I'm a black man. I'm down here in the South. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead. We hear you.
Yes, I'm down here in the South, and I'm a Republican. And what I see is, like this post here, these guys who create these polls and make a determination who's going to win and who's going to lose. And then when it doesn't go the way of the political leaders, as far as I believe it's the media running everything, if it don't go their way, then they come up with this story. Just like the story of why Trump won the election because it was Russians. There's been no proof of that, man. It's a sick game that's being played. And just like these recent elections, like you still got problems down in Florida, we still got problems in Arizona, and we still got problems in Georgia where it's going to be a mess. And it's all created by what people, the posters coming up with these so-called, Democrats supposed to have a blue wave. It wasn't a blue wave. And now people wondering what's going on with the election. There's a problem. Did the Russians come in and Russians come in and do it again? It's crazy. It's madness. And it's just destroyed for the small-minded people who won't believe a lie. It's affecting them. And then they want to come up and run into news reporters' houses and beat on their doors and act like they doing something wrong to them, that they manipulating people's minds. It's crazy. I just ask that posters that instead of just going to people and saying, well, this is how it's going to come out, the Democrats going to win it all or the Republicans going to win it all, I wish people just go and talk to people and understand why they really vote. Man, people vote for different reasons. And you can say like Obamacare. This Obamacare is a disaster. It's a disaster.
Great points by Dwayne. Now, the first point I want to make, and just the pollster's job, I would say it's about 80-20. 20% of it is to predict and predict correctly. About 80% of it is to explain why voters went to the polls. I think we have a very good idea. Obviously, it's variable across states and across regions, but we have a pretty good idea, as I've emphasized before. Democrats want much more there because of Trump on the one hand, as well as health care. Republicans much more for immigration, but other sort of issues such as small government. Now, to his point about the blue wave, I absolutely agree. I think whether you talk about a blue wave or a red wave, it's all political spin. And indeed, to be quite frank and just look at the numbers, be very empirical, if both the Republicans and the Democrats performed about at the average, let me explain. On the House side, which the Democrats have taken, the historic average since the Civil War is 33-seat gain to the party out of power. The party out of power in this case are the Democrats. They'll probably slightly outperform that. Maybe you're in their high 30s, right now at their 33, but they're about at the average. We expect it on the Senate side because of the difficult map for Democrats and the easier map for Republicans. Probably the Republicans would hold the Senate, maybe expand their lead by 2 or 3. It looks like we're in that range. So I would just emphasize the point, which is both parties performed about at what we expected, about at the average. And the last point is we have to be always very careful about midterms because often people believe they say something about the general elections when they really don't. They say something about today, but very little about what will happen in the future.
There was talk about a Democratic wave, and we did see in the South places like Texas and Georgia and Florida where candidates like Beto O'Rourke, Stacey Abrams, and Andrew Gillum did better than expected. What's going on in the South with those states?
Well, I do think long-term we have demographic change. Indeed, we do know that if we're talking decades-long change, we're going from a majority white country to a majority non-white country. We're going to a more homogeneous country to a less homogeneous country, and that's a fact. But specifically with these midterms, I believe that it's only natural to have the party out of the power, in this case, the Democrats, to be more energized than Republicans. And I think in part it was a function of that, was that the Democratic base was more energized in these places. Once again, historic average of a party out of power is 33 seats. They're performing about at the average, a little bit better. And so I would kind of couch it or frame it that way. The last point is candidate selection in these off-term elections is very important. And these were, very energizing, attractive candidates that perhaps were able to push the needle even a little bit more. But once again, I don't believe that the Democrats performed much better than what we thought they were going to. And we always have to be careful when we talk about blue or red waves.
Let's go to Ann, who's calling from Washington, D.C. on the Democratic line. Ann, good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for taking my call. I would like to be helpful in elections. Asking you about what is the protocol for pollsters who call your home. I mean, I don't mind answering those calls, and I don't mind giving out information, but they don't want to say who is sponsoring the poll, and so I don't answer. I don't say anything at all about it. What's the protocol, or are you hiring people who are pollsters who are not legitimate, or are they not really interested? Why are they afraid to tell who they are or who they're calling for?
That's a great question. To be quite frank, when it comes to political polling, we at Ipsos no longer do telephone interviewing. It's very intrusive. It's hard to get a hold of people. We do it online. It's less intrusive. People who want to participate can. Those that don't. But the protocol should be a legitimate pollster should always be extremely transparent. They should be upfront about who they are, what they're doing, and indeed, if they don't do that, I would be suspect. And so best practice is always to be transparent, always to be upfront. You can, if you want, put your name on a no-call record or list, very much like telemarketing. But again, I think transparency is always key, whether it be transparency in our methodology on the one hand, being upfront when we call places on the other. And if someone's not doing that, I would be suspect.
Since we're on this subject, is there a way that normal Americans can tell the difference between an actual poll, a real pollster that's calling them, and a push poll that's trying to push them into voting one way or the other? How can you tell?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a really good question, and yeah, that's what I was kind of alluding to, kind of like indirectly or implicitly. So what is the difference? One is legitimate. We want to know who you're going to vote for, why you're going to vote for that person, et cetera. The other one is they're pushing some sort of one side or the other with some sort of messaging or spin. It's very hard to tell the difference. I think you have a right to ask what the purpose is. Often a legitimate pollster who just wants to get an idea about the facts of what's going on will be upfront about who they are. A push pollster, a push polling will be much more spin, and it's framed in a biased way, one way or another. It's hard to make the distinction, but I think citizens should be upfront and ask, what is the purpose of this poll? And if you don't feel comfortable, you could always report it.
Let's go to Kathy, who's calling from Paragould, Arkansas on the Republican line. Kathy, good morning.
Morning, Kathy.
Good morning. We was talking about the in Florida, Arizona, and Georgia. Well, the lady in Florida, the supervisor lady there in Florida, was hiding votes for the Democrats, and this is what needs to be on the news. And Rick Scott took it to court, and he won. And they're making her get them votes back. you see, it makes you wonder if the Democrats even won fair the House, because they'll do anything to win an election. And this is what needs to be on the news, the truth. And thank you, and you have a good day.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a great. I think just stepping back a bit about the guest's point, we have to also understand. I talked about polarization. We're highly polarized along ideological lines. Immigration, as an example, is a great example. But across the board, Americans do not believe that the system is working anymore, and that goes to the media on the one hand, a widespread disbelief that the media is actually being truthful, a widespread belief that parties and politicians care about the common person. And this example of basically disbelief in the electoral process is part and parcel of this overall disbelief, disenchantment with the system. And it's important to kind of emphasize this isn't just an American phenomenon. Ipsos polls across the world. We see this across the Western world, continental Europe and the UK, Latin America. It's a general phenomenon. It's worrisome, obviously, if we don't believe in our institutions. But I think that the caller's sort of feeling of disenchantment, worry, a lack of trust in the system is a function of this wider systemic problem.
Now, you not only polled on what people were thinking in the midterm election, you also looked forward to the 2020 election. So what were people telling you about whether President Trump should or should not be reelected? What did you find out in your poll?
Yeah, and so we have to always be careful polling on the 2020 election, the general elections, in the midterms, and obviously across the board, we saw that Trump loses against any sort of Democratic candidate put up against him on the day of the election this week. And the caveat is the electorate that showed up on election day is much more Democratic on average than not. We have to understand that. Mm-hmm. But overall, when we just kind of ask a general question, we ask, does Trump deserve another 4 years? 54% of Americans said no, 36% said yes. That's an indicator of disenchantment. That said, as I was saying before, we always have to be careful using the midterms as tea leaves for the general election. What we do know is the following. A sitting president in the United States that has a better than 40% approval rating, Trump's around 43, has a better than 50-50 chance of actually winning a re-election. And so he's in a good place, not in an absolute place, but a good place. But definitely today, he's on the downside, especially with the electorate that showed up on election day on Tuesday.
And how does that compare with previous presidents at the same time? Were Barack Obama's numbers different? Were George Bush's numbers different? Were Bill Clinton's numbers different? Is he doing the same as other presidents at this time, or is this different in any way?
No, he's performing about at the average, to be quite frank. And so, each of the presidents that you cited, specifically had problematic midterm elections, right? Mm-hmm. And he did as well. His numbers at 42, 43 are not that much different than Barack Obama's were. Barack Obama's was reelected. And just to emphasize, there's a power of incumbency. We know that incumbents have a threefold advantage over non-incumbents. And he's still in a strong place. We shouldn't read too much into this midterm elections. Many will. Politicos and pundits will. But we have to be very careful with that.
Let's go to Lee, who's calling from Ackworth, Georgia, on the Democratic line. Lee, good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for having me. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Nice to hear you.
Great. So I was just wondering your thoughts on, the way I'm looking at it is that it's more about who feels more threatened. Is it the group that feels, let me start over. It's more about cultural context. Starting with the Civil Rights Act and then to Me Too, women's suffrage, Black Lives Matter, the country is becoming more egalitarian. And I think that's the real distinction. Who is most threatened by that progress? So you have the older, whiter, rural people that want to hold on to the past and go back and make America great again. And then you have minorities and that want real progress, that want equal rights. And I think that might be a more accurate way to see the polarization in the country today. So I was just wondering y'all's thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a great point. Let me reframe it without the kind of the value judgments about whether it's good or bad. What we do know is, as I was saying before, the U.S. is becoming a non-white country. This year's birth cohort was the first birth cohort that was more non-white than white. This plays into identity politics as the in-group starts to feel like they're the out-group and vice versa. We're going through massive social change because of that. And this sort of populist identity politics, this polarization, as the caller was saying, really comes to the fore. And it's important to sort of emphasize a point, which is this isn't just a U.S. phenomenon. As I was saying before, at Ipsos, we poll across countries. We're in 90 countries around the world. We're seeing this across the Western world, across Europe, across Latin America, and this is just part and parcel of our time, which is a highly uncertain, polarized period.
It's way too early, but who is the leading in your poll to be the Democratic candidate to face President Trump in a re-election?
Yeah, so our same-day poll, we asked both the matchups as well as who was more interesting on the Democratic side. We have Biden at 29%. We have Bernie Sanders at 22%, and then sort of everyone else. Once again, these are the figures that are best known, have the best name recognition today. This isn't necessarily indicative of what will happen tomorrow, but it gives us a good idea about the field at this point. I would suspect, given what happened in this electoral cycle, that there are other sort of candidates that have different sort of profiles, maybe younger, maybe non-white, a little bit more diverse, that might have a chance as well. But right now, what we're seeing are two candidates that are very well known to the general population, more specifically to the Democratic base, and they're in the lead right now.
Let's go to Landon, who's calling from Richmond, Virginia, on the Republican line. Landon, good morning.
Good morning, Landon.
Yeah, good morning. The first thing is my friend and I, we sat and watched television. And my friend, she's an adamant Democrat. And I kind of sat on the fence, but I'm more of a Republican in attitude than anything else. The first thing we noticed that we saw people winning that we didn't know anything about. And the term local, all elections are local, came into my mind. I said, well, where do these people come from? I said, where all these beautiful young people come from? Because when you watch television, you generally see the same people, talking heads all the time. And the thing that's kind of disturbing for me when I was watching the Democrats, and I saw a lot of black people on television being Democrats. I said, well, you know what? That's going to make white people, black people only 10% of the population. That's going to make white people think that the Democratic Party is all black. And she said, no. I said, well, look, you got good people on both sides. But to make my conversation short, all the elections are local, and you see new people. And if the new people are the ones that's going to be the winners in the future. Thank you.
Let's see if we can get in one more quick call. Let's get Josephine, who's calling from Detroit, Michigan, on the Democratic line. Josephine, good morning.
Good morning. I wanted to know, why don't they ever mention gerrymandering of the states? And why don't they ever mention about people being thrown off the road who aren't allowed to vote? That's like rigging their election, and that's what Republicans do. Thank you.
What are we seeing when we put up these hypothetical Democratic candidates against President Trump? How are they doing in your generic poll, in your poll?
Yeah, across our same-day poll, as I was saying before, independent of who we put there, whether it be Biden or someone generic as an example, whether it be Sanders, they were outperforming Trump by 10%, about 10%. Again, I want to emphasize that's indicative of today, of the electorate that showed up on Election Day. It was a much more Democratic-leaning electorate. The high turnout helped them in this midterm election. And we have to be very, very careful because tomorrow might be slightly different. And more importantly, as we know, an incumbent has a built-in advantage. But what we saw with this higher turnout was much more Democratic, as I was saying before, profile, and about a 10-point on average lead of any sort of hypothetical or real Democratic candidate put up against Trump.
We'd like to thank Cliff Young from Ipsos for coming in and sharing their great poll with us. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you.
Coming up, Derek Willis from ProPublica will be here to talk about how congressional leaders control debate on legislation. And later on, our Spotlight on Magazine series continues with a look at America's role in the world with national interest contributor Henry Now. Stay with us.
Coming up this weekend on Book TV. Today at noon Eastern, the Southern Festival of Books from